and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Dennis Ja.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another edition of the Liberia History Channel on Focus on Liberia. This is the Liberia History Channel where we talk about Liberian history. Never has it been in the history of Liberia that we have a podcast that is exclusively devoted to the history of Liberia. Most of the time you hear, oh, Liberian history. Yes, Liberia does have history just like any other country. And we are exploring Liberian history. I'm blessed to have my man, Ansoni. Oh, let me tell you something about Ansoni. This guy doesn't just talk politics. He talk other stuff. Ansoni, welcome to the Liberia History Channel. I'm glad to have you.
Dennis, I'm excited to be here. I'm learning a lot from the Liberian History Channel, and I think many Liberians are, and all Liberians need to pay attention to the Liberian History Channel. History is who we are, and until we know our history, we will not be able to know who we actually are. According to our presenter here, we have to know our history in order to understand who we are, where we're coming from. Then we will be able to know where we're going in a profound way. Let us do this.
Thank you. And history is very important because it is based on history that you're going to value yourself. If your history tells you that, you were a big man, your ancestors were warriors and great people, and then you kind of start to love yourself a little more. But if you don't know that and you just go around with kind of little sorrowful self. So I put the history books behind me there to tell you that I read all of them. That's a joke. Let me welcome Mr. Jabari Lamb. Mr. Jabari is a fellow Liberian and of the BAIO. Mr. Jabari is our co-presenter. Welcome, Jabari.
It's great to be back on as usual.
And let me welcome our presenter here, or I would say chief presenter, Carl Fambule. I mean, all my manner, but this name just beat me. But Carl, welcome to the Liberia History Channel.
It's always my pleasure to be here.
And we want to welcome all our viewers from across the globe. This is the Liberia History Channel, and we are going to be talking Liberia history. Today, we'll be doing our president series, Presidents of Liberia. I memorized the list of the presidents when I was in grade school, but I didn't know much about these presidents, and now I'm learning everything that I know now about Liberian presidents is from the Liberia History Channel. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Jabari. Thank you, everyone who has contributed to Liberia History Channel to be able to understand and learn a little more about my own country. I'm not ashamed to say it, and I know most of us, we are learning new things here on the Liberia History Channel. Today, we're going to be talking about a very important president, and that's Daniel Edward Howard. Daniel Edward Howard, who was the 16th president of Liberia. He was in office January 1912 to January 1920. That's the man we're going to be talking about today. And let me pass it to Carl, who's going to lead this.
Howard, Toga, Marbasa members of the Liberian History Guild call him Toga. Toga means man of war. So he was the Lord of War. He was Liberia's wartime president. Internal insurgencies, and as well as he was the World War I president. We're going to have to present President Howard in two parts. And that is because so much happened between 1912 and 1920, which seems like a short period of time. But in the history of Liberia, this was an extremely turbulent time in our history. And Howard, our Basa president, led the charge, and he did so with violence and diplomacy.
Carl, this is very new. You say Howard was our Basa president. I can't wait to learn about Howard. Backup president?
Yes, I am convinced that Daniel Howard was not only Bassa on his mother's side, which most people believe, but I believe his father was also Bassa, his father, Thomas Howard, for reasons we'll explain as we proceed with the show.
Mr. C, have you heard that before? Howard being Bassa?
And then that is what we are about to learn from the presentation today. That is one of the reasons why anybody listening to the show should share the show right now. Howard bin Baza, I mean, this is new to me. I mean, who have thought that at that time in Liberia we'll have a Baza man to be president? Did we even know this all along? Not until now, Dennis.
We want to welcome all our viewers from across the globe. We are going to learn about the first indigenous president of Liberia, and he was from a Bassa ethnic group. That's why our friends from the Liberia History Guild named him Toga, meaning the man or the man of war. Toga. So we're going to learn about Toga today, and we are happy to be joined by another Bassa man, Darius Jabari Lamb. Let's do this, Carl.
All right. So Toga, and in fact, I would just call him Toga just to get under people's skin. He was a 16th president of Liberia. He was in office from January 1912 to 1920, January 1920. He was born, actually, he was born in Buchanan, and he was actually described as a soft-spoken person, which is the complete opposite of his policy, both domestic and foreign. He was a quiet warrior. This is Mr. Speak softly and carry a big stick. And as you know, in our traditional cultures, when we're raised, we're not really raised to shout and confront. We're raised to negotiate and to communicate. Some of the skills that come from our traditional cultures, as far as communication and the stealthness, not always showing people what's on your mind, these are things that President Howard encompassed and embodied, these skills. Traditionally, our people do not go around shouting what they're about to do or what their plans are. And there's always kind of a soft humility to the presence, of indigenous people that is mistaken quite often for being simple or being subservient. It is not. It is a position of dignity and poise that most of our cultures carry. So I wanted to point that out, but most people would describe him as being soft and introverted. That he absolutely was not. So as usual, we go through, reversing or countering the conspiracy to whiten or erase the blackness of our presidents. On the left, again, this is the image from, our parents' era. Our parents grew up seeing the image on the left. Some of our grandparents grew up seeing, depending on your age, grew up seeing this image on the left. And so most of the people alive today, the image on the left is what they saw of President Howard in their textbooks. Everywhere they looked, this is the image they saw of President Howard until very recently, when information is now being made public via the internet, basically. But before the internet, most people, if you ask them what President Howard looked like, it would be the image that was presented to the world beginning in the early 1950s. Courtesy of F.R. Bruns from the Smithsonian Institute, who was a USAID consultant to Liberia, helped to create all of these wonderful de-Africanized images. And so on the right is the official presidential photograph of President Howard, not a drawing, but his actual photograph. So as you can see, he looked like a regular Bazonga, the average Bazonga. You take him right now, you put him in Buchanan, and nobody will look at him twice. Maybe except for the little twisty thing at the end of his mustache. That might throw people off. So, Any questions on that? I'm going to go to the next
Yes,
slide.
and this is a, I know we talked about this many times, that the presidents in some pictures, they're being lightened up for whatever reason. We talked about this before, but we're saying not just Howard, but there were other presidents who actual photographs were not presented. What we are used to in both is this kind of lighter skin president. But in the case of Daniel Edward Howard, his right, or the actual photograph, is the one on the right. And we've, Carl, we talked about this many times, Jabari, that for some reason people decided to make them look exactly what they're not.
Yes. So, I mean, it's deliberate, of course. If it's part of a propaganda tool to make people feel that the presidents did not look like them. We do have Liberians who are very, very light skinned. They are equally just as Liberian as everyone else. We have indigenous Liberians who have European ancestry. We have the descendants of African Americans who have European ancestry. So it's not that we don't have light skinned Liberians. Is that the majority of the population doesn't resemble the image on the left. And in order to create this concept or this idea that you are not, capable of leadership and the leaders of the past do not reflect you, they made sure that they erased and altered their image in order to carry and push forward in an agenda and a narrative that clearly was not true.
Thank you. And as we go into this, because this is new to many of our viewers about his ethnicity, so you will expect questions like this: do the Bassa people claim him, or did he himself claim that he's Bassa? Things like that, we'll get it. But as we go into the presentation, these questions will be answered. Like for me, Grebo people don't have to claim me, right? Because there's no need for that. So, but as we go into presentation, we're going to come across this kind of thing to see why.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Dennis, I would ask you to not read comments and interrupt the presentation. Just let us go forward, and at the end, they can save their questions because a lot of these things will be answered.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
And so, yeah, and of course, do mono people claim me? Do they have to claim me for me to be mono? And what does it mean to be mono? What does it mean to be Bassa? What does it mean to be Grebo? Does it mean if you're a cloud man that you must wear a loincloth and to go shirtless and constantly fish, that you must live like your ancestors? I mean, what does it mean? Isn't Sony no longer a cloud man? Is he no longer the son of his father and the grandson of his grandfather because he now wears a button-down shirt and has command of the English language? I mean, at what point do we determine what ethnicity is? And the second point I want to make to that for everyone who's listening, I want you to remember that the constant theme throughout the History Channel, all these presentations, has been that ethnicity is fluid. It is not necessarily genetic. But in this particular case, if you were to trace his genetic ancestry, he is a Bassa man.
All right.
Daniel Edward Howard was born in Buchanan, Grand Bassa County on August 4, 1861, to Thomas and Sarepta Ann Howard. Sarepta Ann Howard was the first of Thomas Washington Howard Sr.'s 3 wives. His other 2 wives were Anne and Nancy. Thomas Howard was the second national chairman of the True Whig Party. He worked as printer from 1868 to 1901 at various newspapers and government printing houses. His only government appointment was that of postmaster in 1904. Daniel often worked closely with his father. Thomas Howard was of the Lodge of United Brothers of Friendship and the Mysterious 10 of Liberia.
Yes. So he was born in Buchanan. One of the things that bullet number 2 is actually a cite. I forgot to enter the citation. This is from Power and Press Freedom by Dr. Patrick Burrows, who is someone that I consider to be an absolute pioneer in Liberian history as far as reversing or countering the conspiracy to bury our history. He is the pioneer, one of the premier pioneers in that area. When I say pioneer, I mean it in the sense of he's doing groundbreaking work. He, interestingly enough, doesn't say that Thomas Howard was married 3 times. He says Thomas Howard had 3 wives. Very interesting choice of words. And that could infer polygamy, because if you have 3 wives at once, you're practicing polygamy. Now, we do know that Sarepta was Basa. That's not a question. So Sarepta Ann was a Basa woman. And the other 2, I, do not have any information on, but I would not imagine that a woman from African American heritage would be involved in a polygamous marriage at that point in history. It just doesn't seem, logical. But like I said, I don't have enough information on those 2. And then Thomas Howard, being the 2nd national chairman after the founder of the Truett Party, he was only the 2nd national chairman. I want people to remember that before even the country was a country, when it was just a settlement, when it was just a colony and then became a commonwealth, there were schools at Bassa, at Montserrado, up the St. Paul River, at Cape Palmas, at Sino, at these various places. And these schools had in attendance, and churches had in attendance, many indigenous people as early as the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. What becomes of these children of indigenous people who are born around 1800s, or 1810s, start school in in the 1820s when Liberia opens these schools. Even before Liberia was established, there were missionaries in the area on the coast, and we've already talked about that in previous episodes. But the number of indigenous people that start attending school, even before Liberia is a commonwealth, once it becomes a commonwealth, once it becomes a country, these people are culturally are more culturally similar to the westernized African repatriates than they are to the people who gave birth to them. This photo is from 1906, and it's just the oldest photo I could find of a Bassa woman who has been probably 1 or 2 generations removed from her tradition. And this Bassa woman, Sir Harry Hamilton Johnson, refers to as a Bassa woman of the civilized type. That's why there's quotations around that. So she's Bassa. Bassa people, whether they're westernized or not, are civilized. So Sir Harry Hamilton Johnson, we've talked about time and time again, being a horrible racist, but those were his words. This woman is like a lot of women in Liberia today who attend church, whether it be Methodist or whatever, and who read and write and speak English, also speak their traditional language. Their children attend schools with all the other children from various ethnic groups as well, and speak English and are typically Christian. So this is what has been going on in Liberia for quite a long time, and this is what Daniel Howard is a product of. So I will pause there. Are there any other questions on these bullets? And then I'll let Jabari take the next slide.
I have a question called, we are learning here that Daniel Edward Howard had 3 wives. Any information on how his wives were helped to him when he was president?
No, this is not Daniel Howard. This is his father, Thomas.
Thomas, okay. Thank you.
This is his father, Thomas. Daniel did not have 3 wives. Daniel had 1 wife.
All right.
Thank you.
So we're talking about his background and his parentage on this slide. And so we're talking about where he came from. Now, I'm not 100% confident that he had these 3 wives concurrently. I'm just saying that the tone and everything consistently implies that these wives were concurrent. There is nowhere where it shows that he got married and remarried. It's always referred to as his 3 wives, which I think is interesting. Because normally if you get a divorce, nobody talks about you have 3 wives. They say your former wife, or for example, you have many people who were remarried in Liberian history, and nobody speaks of their wives. Even President Tubman, nobody says his 2 wives. They only speak of his current wife as his wife. So it was just it's just an inference from the language that was used. So Jabari, you can take over this one.
Yes, so Daniel Howard is elected in 1912, and when he assumes the office on January 1st, 2nd of 1912, at his inauguration, it was given to the native chiefs, which was a new feature in the inauguration and one to be encouraged. And in his inauguration address, Howard laid particular stress upon agriculture, education, and native policy. He is the 3rd native son to hold the presidential office, and this is from Frederick Starr. It was President Johnson and Cheeseman were born in Liberia. So when they mean native son, they're talking about born in Liberia. He's the 3rd one to be born in Liberia. Another interesting fact to consider is at this time, the native population is heavily integrated into Liberian society. It was estimated that the number of educated Liberians or Liberians who have been Christianized, civilized, quote unquote, was 40,000 compared to the American Liberian 12,000 to 15,000. So it just shows that there were a lot more educated Liberians at the time, which played a major role in Howard's election.
Yeah, so one of the things I want to point out is that the asterisk there, President Johnson and Cheeseman were also born in Liberia, but their fathers were born in the United States. I find it very peculiar that Frederick Starr puts native in quotations. It's like, even though people were calling him the native son, nobody really called Cheeseman or Johnson native sons, but Frederick Starr makes a point to say, oh, he was the 3rd native son. And almost as if at this point, this is after Harry Hamilton Johnson's gone to Liberia. This is when they're starting to want to change the narrative. Remember that Frederick Starr, these guys are coming in to really create an idea that native means uncivilized, that native means naked, that native means illiterate. And that once you have transcended in their minds what they think is a transcendency, this condition, you are just Liberian. This is the mindset that they want to push. And this is the propaganda. I wouldn't even call it propaganda. It's basically feeding people the idea that once you have become educated, you're no longer native. And even to this day in Liberia, when somebody says, oh, this is a native woman, they really mean to say this is an illiterate woman. This is an uneducated woman. That's really what they're saying. And so when I say I'm a native woman, or my mother, my very educated mother says I'm a native woman, people roll their eyes and laugh. But this is one of the problems that we have in our society. So this slide is here really to just illustrate some of the earliest examples of trying to basically acculturate, and it's these political writers like Frederick Starr. But when we get on a little further, when you start to see how U.S. intelligence writes about Howard, it's completely different. Next slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
Secretary Howard is the son of Thomas Howard, who for years was chairman of the National True Whig Party and treasurer of the Liberian Republic. Comparatively, a young man, Secretary Howard is a natural leader of men. Frank, honest, and decisive, he may be truly described as the Mark Hannan of Liberian politics. He received his education at Liberia College, that's now the University of Liberia, and in the study and management of men. Proud of his race and country, he is, to my mind today, the strongest single factor in the Liberian Republic. He has large influence with the Aborigines because of his ability to speak fluently a number of native tongues, and he is usually relied upon to settle the native palavers and difficulties. He is chairman of the National True Way Committee and for years has been keeping intact and commanding the great forces of his party. He is a political leader of the highest order. It is said of him that to his friends he is as true as steel, and that he does not know what it is to break a political promise. He was governor of Monserrado County and is now the master of Liberian finance. In his position as chairman of the National True Way Committee and Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Howard, in recommendations to the president and otherwise, has conferred so many political favors that he is regarded as the people's candidate with special claims upon the leaders. His county of Monserrado polls more votes than all the other three counties together, and with the loyal support of his county and with at least an even chance with his rival on the coast, it is very difficult to see how the Liberian presidency can escape this Liberian song in the next National True Way Convention. Jabari?
So during this time, especially when he says his next political opponent, we've talked about people before, that's James J. Dawson. So it was Daniel E. Howard and James J. Dawson who were the two contenders for the presidency. Daniel E. Howard, as we see, he comes from a legacy. His father was leader of the True Way Party. He's a Bassa man who can speak numerous languages, so he's able to communicate with different electorates. He is in the largest county in Liberia, Monserrado County, and so the environment was really conducive and favorable for him to be elected president, and that's eventually what happened.
And Mr. C, you had a question? You're saying something?
Yeah, from the reading, we learned that it's said of him that he does not know what it is to break a political promise. That begs the question: how was he? Why was he looked at that way or seen that way? What are some of the things that he did to come to that conclusion that it was this person who didn't know how to break a political promise?
The upcoming slides will show his career path, so we can go through that.
Okay.
Call, you are muted if you're saying something.
One of the things that strikes me about this, besides the fact talking about his father speaking multiple languages, native languages, those languages specifically are Bassa, Glable, and Klau. Those are the three languages. Native speakers at that time in history, if you spoke Bassa, you would easily be able to learn the other related languages. So it was very common for Bassa people to also be able to understand and somewhat communicate in Glable and Klau, what we call Kru today. So this is what his father was able to do. And also, if you understand the culture, there are certain things that are very much constant, which is this idea of promise keeping your word. Your word is your honor. These are very, very traditional values among our people, that when you say something, when you are sworn to something, you don't deviate from that, no matter what. And so when they describe him as being someone who keeps his promise, it's not strange to me. This is what our people did. This is our tradition, is to be sincere to our word. It's also important to point out that Howard's father was an activist also. He also was an activist for native rights. He borrowed the American slogan from the Boston Tea Party, no taxation without representation. So these were the people who were saying, hey, we need to be incorporated in the government. This is that first group of the educated class. This is not something that just happened for the first time in the 1960s and 70s in Liberia. This is 1900, the late 1800s, that Thomas Howard, the father of Daniel Howard, was pushing this forward.
So here, Carl and Jabari say Thomas Howard was chairman of the National True Whig Party. Here they say
Yes.
Daniel was national chairman of the National True Whig Committee.
Yes.
Those two are different. Please explain that. And then it says he's from Montserrado County. Why not Bassa?
Because Thomas resided in Montserrado. And this is what's also, thanks for bringing that up. The idea that if you are born somewhere, that you're always tied there. Thomas lived in Montserrado. His son was born in Bassa. He had a home in Bassa, but he considered himself to be from Montserrado because that's where he primarily lived and worked. People would migrate to Montserrado County to work. That's where all the printing presses are. As you'll see later, he's a printer. So it's a low-level job. It's not something big and fancy, but that's what he did for most of his career, working at various printing presses. So if you live in Montserrado, you're from Montserrado. This idea that your county is connected to your ethnicity or what language you speak is relatively recent. It really comes from the Tubman era, with the exception of, Marylanders and things like that. So when the Constitution says you cannot have two people from the same county, you're going to notice that the vice president to Daniel Howard is from Bassa. Though Howard was born in Bassa, he considered himself being a president from Montserrado because that's where he spent most of his life. So his vice president was constitutionally correct, even though he was from Bassa, because at the time that Howard became president, he was now a resident of Montserrado. Sure. Is that clear for everyone? So unlike now in politics, just to bring it to what we do now, because whether I was born in Ghana or not, which I was not, but I would, in my Monrovia, they would say, you're not going back to NIMBA to go register to vote because I'm a mono woman. So I'm supposed to go to NIMBA to register to vote, even if I wasn't born in NIMBA, even if I had been born in Montserrado or wherever else. And this is a really bad precedent that we've set in recent years, that everyone thinks that they're somehow tied to their county of birth because of ethnicity and language. Right. They don't understand that they're universally Liberian, that if you live in Montserrado, this is where you should vote, because that is where your vote is going, especially for representatives, is going to affect your life. Right. So going back to your county and voting for people to do things in places that you don't live is not what the Constitution was designed for, which is why Darius DeLong could be a senator from Montserrado County, because though he was born in Buchanan, he resided in Montserrado County at the time that he ran for office. He did not have to go back to Buchanan to be a representative.
And not to, and that is that's something too that people need to look at now, because even people that are representing Montserrado as senator, city mayor, and this, because of their ethnicity or whatever reason, they're more tied to Lofa County, for instance. If your county meet is all Lofa, if your development, this is son of Lofa, and so vote and all this kind of thing.
Yeah, and this is a very recent phenomenon with our people. It's not something that was normal in the past.
My question on this before we move in, let me mention the source of this document, what I just read, the American Political Science Review 1911. So that's good. It said his county, Montserrado, polls more votes than all the other three counties together. So it was Montserrado, Grand Bazaar, and is that Cape Mount or Sino?
I'm sorry, say that again?
The three counties they're talking about, they say Montserrado County polls more votes than all the other counties together. And so Bazaar is the second county. The third, is that Cape Mount or Sino?
Yes, Cape Mount.
Cape Mount. All right. And so here, the more votes, because at this time, do you have a lot of people from the Barbados and then the Congo?
So the largest population of Liberians, if we're going to group all of the indigenous ethnic groups and consider them one population, which clearly they were not, but let's just do that for the sake of time, that would be the largest group of educated voters, period, followed by people who would be repatriates from Congo Basin, the Caribbean, all of those people combined. I'm sorry, that would be the third group. And the second group would be descendants of African Americans. And at this point, you're talking majority of the descendants of African Americans also have other heritage because people intermarried a lot. You don't have a lot of, new ships rolling in. So people are getting married to local people who are educated. So, but the majority of the population of Liberia at this point, the majority of the citizens are not descendants of African Americans at this point in history.
Educated Liberians outnumber the Americos 3-1. It's an overwhelming, even just the educated alone.
They're all Liberians, Jabari. Even the descendants of the repatriated African Americans are also Liberians. But what Jabari is saying is people who consider themselves to be indigenous, native to the soil, are in greater number. Their educated population is in greater number than the population of the descendants of African Americans.
Thank you.
So this is an extract from a letter. I want you to only read the portion that's in brackets.
Mr. Howard, Secretary of Treasury, is one of the most violent opponents to progress of any kind and practically defies the president. He is a most ignorant, corrupt, and conceited individual and has done a great deal of harm by fostering and encouraging bad feeling towards Europeans here. Owing to this position, he has a certain amount of power, being in possession of the purse strings, and he doles out bribes and presents, which are, as a rule, embezzled from the treasury to the creatures who follow in his train. All right.
So some absurd hate speech. Huh?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say some hate speech from the British. So at this point in history, this is the time when they had convinced Liberians were playing a game of cat and mouse with Western Europe and America. The British are trying this is when he was Secretary of the Treasury under Arthur Barclay. And they're trying really hard to get Liberia into a type of debt situation where they can use that as leverage to seize their Liberian territory, to seize Liberia, period, and put it under the subjugation of the British. They have tried military strategies. They've tried to incite wars. They've tried to do anything they can to colonize Liberia. And this loan was another attempt. It was Daniel Howard who stood along with the legislature, who the British tried to bribe to pass the loan. If you remember from the past episode, and the legislature said, no, we are not going to pass the loan. So the British are assuming that Howard bribed the legislature to reject the loan, which makes absolutely no sense. The country's broke. Where are you getting the bribe money from? And you're rejecting money. So instead of them owing this to the integrity and patriotism of these people, the British are trying to paint this man as a corrupt person who bribed people to not take a loan, which makes absolutely no sense. Because if they had taken the loan, if he was so corrupt as they say, he would have been the one in charge of the money. So he would have been able to take this money and just squander it. So why would he bribe the legislature to reject a loan that if he was corrupt, he would be spending without, any checks and balances in the first place? So in their hatred, they say things that make no sense. And if you sit down and just process the information they present against us, you'll realize that their hatred makes them illogical. We always say in this show, racism makes people stupid. This statement that's in brackets is stupid. It makes no sense. An intelligent person reading this clearly sees that no corrupt person is going to bribe someone to prevent them from getting money. But again, they're talking about Africans, so anything goes. And then referring to our people as creatures. At this point that this occurs, this letter is the catalyst for an extreme economic embargo against Liberia. It is with this that every world power, with the exception of Germany, cuts off economic trade ties and relationships with the Republic of Liberia. This is an economic embargo, the beginning of an economic embargo, which then starts to spark conflicts in the country, because when you are now starving people, both indigenous and the descendants of repatriates are now going to be under serious economic pressure from outside.
Call, I mean, if you fast forward to today, if this piece, what is in parentheses there, if it were written by America, we normally don't question it. So this is different time. So anyone watching the presentation now and know what the Americans, the people write about Liberia, how do you contrast the two? Because normally what they write, because we our president, especially depending on which side you're on, whatever they write is like gospel. What's different about this?
You have to understand the intention. That's the key thing. Intention is going to determine how they're going to write. And so their intention is they want Liberia to be under their rule, and Liberia won't. So you have to say, oh, they hate Europeans. They're trying to sabotage us. These are the evil Africans, because that is their intention. So intention is what matters, because that's going to show the tone and the language.
When they talk about progress, and this is why I say we have to always see the world through our own eyes, their progress is our digress, right? Their progress is our digress. So their progress to them is subjugation, total domination, colonization, imperialism. That is their progress. That is not our progress. Our progress is sovereignty. Our progress is self-determination. So when he says he's the most violent opponent to progress of any kind, they're speaking of their kind of progress, which means for them to increase, Africans decrease. So Howard understood. And this is also the position of President Arthur Barkley. Howard wasn't going against the president. This was what they had to do. They had to play good cop, bad cop. Barkley at this time, we talked about during the Barkley episode, was pretending to pander to them. But he had his foot soldiers in the legislature and in his cabinet. While he goes and smiles and signs treaties, they block him. And then he can go back and say, oh, sir, I tried, but my legislature won't pass it. Which is why later on the Liberians become, the Americans and Europeans say, look, we need to install a dictator, because these people, the legislature is blocking us. There's too much power, in the House of Representatives. Even if we get the executive to agree, even their cabinet go against them. It's too much freedom. We got to install a dictator. So this is sowing the seeds for unfortunate times to come. But it is also showing defiant self-determination, a defiance to imperialism, a defiance to white global supremacy. This is showing African self-determination, Africans standing up and saying, we too are human beings, and we will conduct ourselves as such.
And Carl, you talk about the loan, and that was what they were trying to use to gain leverage to control. It's illogical now to look at even current loans that coming from Westerners. That way, that's the first piece of it. And the word that they use, creatures. They're talking about, his creatures who follow him. How could you say you have good intention to help the people of Liberia by giving them loan for development, I would suppose, but then you like calling their leaders creatures? Did the people of Liberia, the ordinary citizen, have any understanding that, oh, well, these people trying to help us, and down our leaders don't want to maybe give in? That's why they're calling them creature. I mean, it's more like divide and rule. Did the ordinary people listening to that, or how were they paying attention to some of these things at the time?
So there's not one voice of ordinary people.
Mm-hmm.
So most people who were educated, mm-hmm. most people who understood the world understood that the Liberian leadership was defending their sovereignty.
Okay.
This was an act of strong patriotic defiance. These men are in a position where they understand that they're up against the most powerful people in the world. African people globally are basically just a step outside of being enslaved. They just abolished slavery, and most of the Black people on the planet are under extreme subjugation. Even on the continent of Africa, sovereignty has been erased with colonialism 20, 30 years earlier. So here's the last bastion of hope for Africa, right? On the continent, you've got Ethiopia fighting Italy to remain sovereign. And you've got Liberia fighting the entire European world and the United States, in some cases, to remain sovereign. While America doesn't want to take Liberian territory, America wants economic control of Liberia. So this, I think at the time, many Liberians understood it, and I'm sure some other Liberians didn't. And just as today, there's people don't always see things the same way. And which is why you had a huge group of Liberians that were able to be incited to hold the British flag and plant it on Liberian soil and say, no, we want Britain to rule us. It's too hard under these people in Monrovia. We have all these economic embargoes. We're starving. We can't sell our goods like we used to. The ships have stopped coming to our ports. So the people in Sino, the people in Maryland, at Cape Palmas, you've got groups there angry because of this economic embargo is squeezing them. So their solution is, you know what? Let's just have the British just come so we can eat. So we can go back to having, the gravy train we had before of trade. This is really what caused these, what they call crew uprisings. And it wasn't just crew people. I mean, crew isn't really a real thing, right? There's cloud people, Grable people, other people who are wanting the economic embargo to stop. So that these riots and uprisings are for economic reasons. So we have conflicts that are based on economic reasons, like every other human body in the world, all the other human beings in the world get to have the legitimate cause of their conflict articulated. But when they speak of African people, they speak of Liberia, they say, oh, the crew wars, the bush people just jump out and start fighting. No, these people were intelligent. They were fighting. They made a decision, a calculated decision. And it was an economic decision. They were fighting for an economic, for the ability to be able to make money again, to be able to take care of themselves again. It was, hunger season because of this embargo. It's the same thing that happened when they put a recent embargo against Cuba. You had Cubans that were so upset about this embargo. Some Cubans were in favor of Castro and others wanted to overthrow Castro because they were tired of being poor and suffering under the economic pressure of the world. That is what they did to Liberia long before they did it to Cuba. So you have to understand that people in the society do not necessarily want to starve because you want to be patriotic. They're like, you know what? To heck with this country. We will be British. Here, plant the British flag because it's too hard to be rebellious in this environment.
And this, we should also know that this letter is confidential, right? So just imagine how many confidential letters being written now, but we don't get to see it.
We won't see it until it's no longer important. Yeah. Then they declassify it.
So to go into intelligence, like she said, these were smart men, and Howard has been there since the very beginning when he was young. He was a private secretary under President Hillary R.W. Johnson. In 1892, he was the clerk of the Court of Sessions and Common Pleas, Montserrat County. In 1900, he was secretary of the True Whig Party. From 1900 to 1904, he was superintendent of Montserrat County. From 1906 to 1911, he was chairman of the True Whig Party, following in the footsteps of his father. 1906 to 1912, he was secretary of the Treasury, and then finally he gets to be president from 1912 to 1920, and his vice president was Samuel G. Harmon.
Now, this Harmon was one of the most wealthy, powerful Liberians. Harmon was a descendant of repatriated African Americans. This is a photo of his house in Bassa. He was, in contrast, grew up extremely wealthy, in contrast to President Howard, who had a very, even though his father was very politically active, he wasn't wealthy. He wasn't one of the wealthy merchants of Monrovia. He was just a lowly printing press operator. So it's not that he couldn't send his children to school or afford to do things, but he did not have the kind of financial, he didn't come from the kind of financial background that Harmon came from.
The most comprehensive political move of recent years was the extension of governmental functions by means of taxation. The universal hot tax legislation passed since the presidency of Mr. Howard has already raised the motto well known in American history: no taxation without representation. Its natural immediate outcome is inquisitiveness on the part of the Aborigines, who, why they should be taxed, and the keener interest in the movements of the central government. The only effective reply the government can make is intelligent readjustment to the situation, the pragmatic test of which must be mutual understanding between the local chiefs and the central government. So the hot tax is really a unifying measure. Really. You still muted, Cole.
I mean, am I still okay? I'm not the one putting myself on mute. I don't know if it just happens automatically. So I want you to read the next slide, please, because this is just part of the.
For years back, there have been representatives in both branches of the legislature from the Aborigines, in which particularly the Gribbles have enjoyed precedence due to literacy qualification. The Bassa tribe was represented in the cabinet by President Howard. The Crews, Mandingos, Vay, and Golas have been native commissioners with others. Thus, practically all tribes have been contributing more or less to the working of the central government. And it must be added that the constitutional literacy qualification would soon be no barrier to the direct representation of the Aborigines, who are being given knowledge of letters in considerable numbers and are keenly interested in the modus operandi of the government.
So this is from 1919. This is the survey, which is the United States Survey Association, which is basically their intelligence. This is their intelligence publication, where they study other countries, gather intelligence, and they put it in this publication, not only for the foreign service workers, but also for the military and other intelligence organizations within the country. Nothing could be more accurate than what they published in the survey in 1919. So this is not published for public consumption. This is published for the diplomatic people to understand the situation. In order for you to know how to infiltrate or change things or affect things, you must clearly study the population. Here they're clearly saying Howard is Bassa. Here they're clearly saying that the literacy requirement of the past, which makes sense, you want to be able to read and write if you're going to work in government, is no longer an issue because there's so many literate indigenous people, as we've been saying throughout this presentation. So here, the Bassa, the Grabos were the #1 representative. They have very old schools in Cape Palmas and Harper, and many of those people were educated before Maryland ever joined Liberia. So the culture in Maryland, in the Republic of Maryland, the country of Maryland, was quite different. Very little boundaries between ethnic groups in Maryland. Very, at that time. And so people were educated, intermarried, and so on. So here you have clear, in no uncertain terms, 1919, they're telling us that basically the country had been incorporated. The same government is going to come out 40 years later and say the opposite. Mm-hmm. And start pushing an opposite narrative, because they had to first study where Liberia was getting its strength and continuity from. How is Liberia always able to jump over these holes that we dig for them? Every hole we dig, they jump over it. This is the reason. So we've got to break this. And they do.
And I just want to add briefly that the person who wrote this article in the survey was a Liberian man who graduated from Harvard. Just FYI on that information in the survey. And when we talk about in the administration represented in this cabinet, you have a man by the name of who's Benjamin W. Payne, who is the superintendent for the Department of Education in the Howard administration, who also is Basa himself, who's dealing with the education. So it shows the incorporation, integration of education and the government.
So you said the person who wrote this is a Liberian?
Yes.
Who's that?
His name was Plenyono Bewolo. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Plenyono Bewolo.
Yes. I'm sorry.
And we've been saying Howard is Basa. So this is one clue, right? Because in this, they say the Basa tribe was represented in the cabinet by President Howard.
Yeah. So Wolo knew that Howard was Basa. Howard knew Howard was Basa. And even in his presidential campaign against Dawson, he was speaking, he was speaking the Cloud, he was speaking the Grebo, he was speaking the Basa to get those people to vote for him. That's the only president that I'm aware of in the entire history of the country that was able to speak 3 different languages to his people. We have had, I've never seen any video of President Doe speaking Kran to motivate people to vote for him. I'm never saying it didn't happen. I've just never read it or seen it. I've never seen video of President Sirleaf speaking Gola. I'm not saying she didn't, but I've not seen it. I've not seen any video of, I've seen We Are Singing in Crew. That was pretty impressive. But, we are not, maybe because most of the country speaks English now, it's not necessary to do that. But I think it's beautiful that Howard utilized language in the way that he did to defeat Dawson.
Right. And in today's Liberia, the way they do it is to speak the Liberian colloquial, which President Yeyia does very well.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Everybody in Liberia doesn't speak colloquial though. You go in Nimba, we just speak English.
No, I know. I know.
Colloquial. So there's a difference between.
Dennis, she had a regular program on the radio that she was using to speak the Liberian colloquial. She did very well, even better than we are.
So colloquial for us that come from Nimba, colloquial is considered urban Grenada English. It is not what people really speak in the interior. If you really think about it, right? That's urban. Like African Americans will say it's Ebonics, or everybody in Liberia doesn't speak that way. That colloquial is not going to help you if you're campaigning in Kolahun, because the rest of the country, for the most part, you speak your dialect as your first language, and then you learn standard English in school. You don't learn colloquial in school. You learn it on the street.
Mm.
So speaking street English to people is okay if you're speaking to street people. That's one of the things when I worked for United Nations, I always said, this is problematic. This is not a consistent vernacular for all Liberian people.
Right. We don't have that, right, Carl? But the closer we can get to it is to speak what we call Liberian English. So if you went anywhere, especially if you're speaking to a crowd in Monrovia, right? If you spoke Gola or Ve or Cloud or Basa, you wouldn't get many people to understand, right? So by far, how people under a large group of people will understand you is if you speak Liberian English or the colloquial.
If you speak Monrovia urban English that we call colloquial, which is a combination of African American, Kwa people's linguistic impact on English. So that's the Basa, the Grebo, and the Montserrato crew impact on English, along with people from Barbados, the Caribbean influence. So the English that Liberians speak is a combination of the what we call the Kwa, the Cloud speaking people, and the African American vernacular mixed with the Caribbean. In the Southeast, if you listen to how President Tubman and others from the Southeast, especially from Maryland, speak, they sound completely different. The English we speak in Nimba sounds completely different.
Right.
So I wasn't saying that they shouldn't speak Colloqua in Monrovia. What I'm saying is Monrovia isn't Liberia. So when Howard was speaking dialect, he wasn't speaking it in Monrovia. He was speaking it when he went to the southeastern counties.
Right, and I get that. What I'm saying here is, as you said correctly, no Liberian president has been able to do what Howard did. That's a fact. I'm saying the closer our president get to that is to speak Liberian English, which many people will understand.
Right. And if they're gonna question Howard's, the people consider Howard to be Basa. Here, Wolo is considering Howard to be Basa. Wolo that Cloudman.
Right.
And if Howard wasn't Basa, then Salif wasn't Gola, and Wea isn't Crew. I mean, that's just it. If Howard wasn't Basa, President Wea isn't Cloud.
Right. And true.
So Howard was educated he attended Liberia College where he studied management. Edward Wilmot Blyden was his former teacher and mentor, which had a major influence on his political ideology. He married the only daughter of the eminent citizen, Reverend J.H. Deputy and Miss Anna E. Richardson. They were very influential repatriates, so where they had a huge influence. President Howard was inaugurated first in January 1912 at the age of 50. Blyden returned from exile to attend his inauguration. During the European and American trade embargo against Liberia, Germany was Liberia's only external partner. World War I put Liberia in a terrible predicament. On August 10, 1914, President Howard issued a neutrality proclamation, and in 1916, all trade with Germany was stopped. Right. So this had to deal primarily, especially at the end, was dealing with Liberia's entrance into World War I, which put Liberia in a difficult position because Germany is on one side and then America, Great Britain, and France on the other. So it's going to create a conflict. So that's why originally they want to be neutral until 1916.
And my question is, did the neutrality proclamation help Liberia after it got into the terrible predicament?
No. Eventually what happens is tensions are going to increase with Germany, and then eventually Germany is going to send a ship to Monrovia and are going to bomb the city. That was the only attack that Germany is going to do. So it doesn't really help Liberia necessarily. But also right. it's a cat and mouse thing. It's also the cat and mouse thing. It's putting the two powers against each other. Germany was an important trading partner, but then Britain and them are willing to help. So then Liberia switches sides and then goes with Britain and France.
I mean, I wouldn't even say it's a cat. It was. This is where it disintegrates, right? So now Germany becomes world enemy. Mm-hmm. And Liberia, they're already angry with Liberia because Liberia's holding on to a little bit of external trade with Germany. But the world is now going against Germany. So Liberia has to decide if they're going to be crushed by the entire world or if they're going to sell out their temporary ally, Germany. No permanent friends, only permanent interest, right? The interest here is themselves. Liberia was functioning like a sovereign nation. No permanent friends, only permanent interest. What is the interest? Liberian sovereignty. Now Germany can no longer help us maintain our sovereignty. We have to sell Germany, kick Germany to the curb, and keep our sovereignty. If it's a choice between our sovereignty and Germany, we're going to choose sovereignty. And that's what Howard did. Unfortunately, Germany bombs Liberia. But it's like all kinds. But we're going to talk about that in part 2. This is just a brief overview. Part 1, we're going to now get into the domestic policy and some of the incredible things that happened during Howard's presidency.
So Howard is making a speech here.
Yes.
With a sincere desire to exhaust every reasonable resource to settle this trouble by peaceful means, our situation was made fully known by the government of the United States, coupled with a request that a war vessel be dispatched to Liberian waters, the commander of which might act as an impartial mediator. Further, a special commission was appointed to investigate and settle peacefully the questions between the crews and the government. That commission was composed of the following gentlemen: Honorable Benjamin W. Payne, Secretary of Education, a native Liberian of the Bassa tribe; Reed Page Clark, a citizen of the United States and General Receiver of Customs. Mr. B.J. Davis, Governor of Monrovia Crew Town, a native Liberian of the Crew tribe, and Mr. J.F. Cooper, Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Your executive felt assured that with a commission so composed, any real grievance which might be brought before it by the crews will have sympathetic hearing and investigation, and any wrong proved redressed.
And Carl,
Yes.
at
So
this
here,
time,
go
go
ahead. I'm
ahead.
sorry. No, go ahead, Antonio.
All right. Yeah, my question at this time, they I see the names here, right? And this is, to me is important because they are calling, or crew people are carrying names that we see as names of Westerners. Because the assumption, yeah, oh, because this person is John B. Richardson, it might be a Congo. But in this particular speech, when he appointed this committee to investigate, we see the names of crew people and other people being the names of Westerners. Uh, so we can't just look at names. That's what I'm gathering from here.
Right. We can't. I mean, you have a lot of prominent people in our country who have Western names, and we know they're not Westerners. So this is not something new. Um, Prince Johnson, who is the chief of staff for the Armed Forces of Liberia, is not a descendant of repatriated African Americans. Anglicized names we covered before. This is a product of education. It's a product of westernization. It's also a product of religion. People like to change, and the concept of that your indigenous names were heathen names. People like to divorce themselves of that when they become baptized and become Christian. So the inheriting of Western names is not unique to Liberia. It occurred all over the world when people became Christian. All over Africa, for sure. I mean, you have Ghanaians with Western names. Those who were incorporated earlier before, or educated earlier before independence, a lot of them had Western names. Not all, but a lot. Same thing. Not everyone that was Westernized. You still had Biwolo. You still had, Didwo Waletwe. You still had all of these people who kept their traditional names, but the majority did not. So that indicates to me that for the most part, it was a choice. And sometimes they would have Western names. They would travel to the United States, come back, and then change their names back to their traditional names. That happened quite a bit as well. For example, the Fambula Freeman clan. Fambulas were freemen before they were Fambula, and decided that they were going to decided, I think his name was Edwin Fambula. One of the Fambulas came here to go to school and decided that he was not going to be Freeman anymore. And he changed his name to Fambula. And when he returned, they decided as a family that they were going to change their name. So even H.B. Fambula Sr., that everybody knows is the most famous Fambula, he and his son, and also the father of the legendary Miata Fambula, his name was Freeman before it was Fambula as well. So you have people who just, you know what, let me go back to my name. Why am I doing this? So there's like an awakening, and they just change their names back. My understanding is Tobana Tikote used to have a Western name before as well. So, I mean, people change their names.
Rudolph Roberts.
Yeah, that's what it was, Rudolph Roberts.
So what's the background of this, the setting up this commission?
So remember when I said that they had these wars were exacerbating because of the economic embargo. Now you have Germany's no longer trading, so things have gone from worse to horrific, right? So now people are asserting that, hey, we've got to do something. And they say the crews, there were some Grable people involved in this as well. There were also conflicts between crews and Grables and certain groups of crews and other groups of crews. I want people to understand when they say this, they don't mean that everybody who was crew was at war with Liberia. It was some clans, some Cloud clans who were at war with Liberia, along with some Grable clans. there were many, many more Kru and Grebo clans who were still sticking with Liberia. So here you have Liberians who are in positions of authority, who are of various backgrounds, coming together to go to try to make peace with people who partially have been incited by the British. And the reason I say this is because on one hand, they do have legitimate economic concerns. The country is poor. The country is starving. And it's because of this hard-headedness and refusal to submit to imperialism. And people are saying it's not worth it. We're going to lose. We're suffering. And it's much easier now for the British to come in and give them a flag and say, here, take down the Liberian flag and raise the Union Jack, and we will come and rescue you. You will become our subjects. You will no longer be citizens of this broke and suffering country. So it is not so simple. So I don't want people to think that this is some kind of conflict where the Kru people are trying to fight for sovereignty. Sovereignty was no longer an option under any flag other than Liberia or England for them. So it was really about economic, conditions and pressure from Great Britain that some people thought was a losing battle. And they were not wrong. They were not wrong for saying it was a losing battle, nor were Howard and the other patriots wrong for saying freedom or death. We're going to stay here, and if we die, we'll die free. Neither side was incorrect. Both sides made rational, intelligent decisions about what position they were going to take.
The boys are energetic.
Yeah, so I love this picture. I just stuck it in here because these are students. These are young students recruited. You have in the back there, one of the employees, I don't know if you can see him, he's got a hat and tie on.
Yeah.
One of the teachers for the school, who a lot of times in those days when they're recruiting these young people, the kids sometimes didn't speak English well, just a little bit of broken English. So what would happen is they would bring teachers in who could speak both languages, English, and if I believe these are our Cloud children, Monserrato Kru children, by the way, there's a difference. So a lot of these kids are, their grandparents or great grandparents came from Nana Kru, from what is now Grand Kru and all these places to West, what used to be called Kru Town, which is now West Point. And so they will go and recruit these kids, and they go to school, and their teachers would be of the same ethnic group, but able to speak standard English, well educated, and then that's how they would teach the kids. And this was under President Howard's Secretary of Education. They focused a lot on educating young people during that time period. So now this takes us into, I don't know how much time we have left, but this is important. This is a drawing depicting Nazo Queen Suakoko, who was, before even the Liberian government, Howard said she was paramount chief, which is a political government role, not a traditional role. Traditionally, she was a queen Zo of a specific clan of Pella people. And when President Howard gave her the position of paramount chief, which I want everyone to know, paramount chief is not an African title. This is a title that was created by the British, adopted by Liberia, as we started to mimic the British policies in order to gain control of the territory that was not under Liberian control, which is now my people in the North and Central Territory, which is now Nimba, Lofa, Bong, and Bapu, which used to be part of Lofa. So the North, when they talk, and part of Grand Jita also. So when you talk about North and Central Liberia, that huge block that was autonomous and separate from the rest of the country, self-governing, during that period of time, when Howard comes in, the Liberian government had absolutely no influence over that part of the country. The British had conquered Samori Toure in the late 1800s and had conquered all the surrounding territories. All the surrounding indigenous groups were subjugated by either France or England. The British had installed their control and were using this paramount chief system as a proxy government to control indigenous populations. Liberia did not have that kind of control. So the indigenous people in the North and Central Territory were almost behaving as a catalyst for rebellion in the colonies. So the British subjects and the French subjects were like, wait a minute, why is it that the clans across the river are not having to pay hut tax to Liberia? Why is it the clans across the river can do whatever they want? They're not having to send servants to the laborers. They're not having to drag their people off the farm and send them down to the coast to build your railroads, to build your infrastructure. Why is it our cousins that are right across the way are living the way we've always lived? So the British and French, for obvious reasons, didn't want these people serving as a beacon of hope that the people that they were controlling could return to their way of life. So they kept pressuring the Liberian government. If you do not go and exert your control over these regions, we will do so with violence. And we will take control of that territory and leave you with just a sliver on the coast that you have control over. Well, this is something that Liberia did not want. Liberia did not want the entire, remaining part of their unincorporated territory to become colonized. The other thing that's happening is that there's wars raging. We have many times talked about these rolling wars. They are not new. There were rolling wars during the transatlantic slave trade, but now the shift has changed to people who are being crushed and robbed of their land and territory in the colonies of England and France are now entering the Liberian territory and fighting with those people for control of their territory because they no longer. So when Queen Suakoko throws herself, people who know the story, throws herself at the mercy of the Liberian government and says, we need to stop these wars. Y'all please come and help us to stop these wars. It's other Pele and Loma clans that are fighting Queen Suakoko's clan. This is going to be the first time that they open up the gateway to allow Liberia in. It is through Queen Suakoko. And many feel that she was a bit of a traitor, and others feel that she was a hero. It is she who says, we are dying, these wars need to stop. It is better that we be Liberian. And so she opens it up for Howard and the frontier forces to come. Interestingly enough, it is Queen Suakoko and her people, which was they had put up almost an impenetrable wall for the Liberians not to be able to enter that part of the country, the part of their unincorporated territory. So there was no way, even when Benjamin Joseph Knight Anderson went to Musadu, he didn't go this route. They took him all around through Boparul and all kinds of things. When he did the second journey, he went up through what they call Zaza, which we now say Zor, which is not actually how it's pronounced, but Zaza. He went up through Zaza, and then it took him westward. He didn't really go into what is northern Bong and Nimba. It is Queen Suakoko that opens that area. When she opens the area, she also, because in Pele, Ta means town. I think also Loma, Ta means town. In the interior regions, Gompa becomes Ganta. They had an area called even Tapata. These are all the things that the Pele people, the people from Suakoko's clan, would call these places. So that's how all of these Mano and dance, or as we call them, Gyo today, settlements end up with the Ta name after them. It was Queen Suakoko that opened up that gateway. Now, I have a letter here on the slide, which is next to Suakoko, unrelated to Suakoko, but I'm going to tie it in. This is a letter from Paramount Chief Wade Dollier to President Tubman. He writes his letter in 1965. So this was fast forwarding to the future so we can come back to the past. There's something interesting that Wade Dollier says in this letter which describes for me, it brought together for me what actually occurred during Daniel Howard's time. He was alive. He was a very old man in 1963 when he wrote this letter. And so during Daniel Howard's time, he was a young man and he was fighting with the frontier forces. But I want you to please read this, one of you, please.
He said, "Dear President Tubman, your goodwill is always the cause of our being around you. I think you know how, I think you know how that I am the only oldest paramount chief in the Tapeta district, and you also know that we helped as pioneers to hew down the political trees of our country." Let me read from this. "Now I need motor road in my chiefdom. Of course, the then Commissioner Senesi Fremont made motor road from Tapeta to a town called Zia, which is the half of 45 miles road to my chiefdom, remaining 22 and a half miles with only a little creek on the road. I'm ready to assist with laborers if you send technical people and bulldozers. Sometimes I come to Monrovia late when you call us because of the lack of motor road in my chiefdom. I am pitifully looking up to you for the request of my respectfully, Ware Dollier, Paramount Chief, Tapeta District." Oh, sorry, Carl. Let me
Okay, so two things. White Dolly, Paramount Chief, the late White Dolly, Paramount Chief, is the father of Yasuo White Dolly, the prominent counselor, lawyer, was vice chairman of the Governance Commission. He has many very brilliant descendants. His granddaughter is the Deputy Minister of Justice currently. She's Cole Dolly. So he has many brilliant and educated, eminent descendants in Liberia and around the world. This man said something in his letter that moved me, which was, they helped the pioneers hew down the big trees of this country. The reason that's important is because that hewing down of the big trees occurred during Daniel Howard's era. We said before that when Daniel Howard was inaugurated, it was the first time that all of the indigenous leaders, even outside of the controlled territory of Liberia, where the Liberians were not allowed to go, got word and attended his inauguration. They saw him as themselves. They saw him as their son. This is the first time in the history of Liberia that territory was opened up to a leader, and Suakoko partly out of desperation, but also trusted Howard because she knew that he was a native son. So they had let down their guard because this was an indigenous man. Ethnicity is fluid. It's what you do. Your culture is what you do. It's how you think. It's not necessarily your blood. Howard culturally was extremely westernized. Though he spoke languages, his value system was different. He valued the modern state over the traditional state. He in his mind understood that for Liberia to survive, certain components of our traditions had to die. Those components of our traditions were those big trees in the forest that had been the political power that had kept the Liberian government out of the North and Central Territory from its inception. And so with this invitation to help to stop these wars, Howard is now going to use the young, at the time, White Dole was young, and all of these other frontier forces, some of whom were then later made paramount chief in their old age, were then empowered to hew down the big trees of the forest to make way for Liberia. It could have never happened had these true zoes of the forest remained in power. They needed to be removed and replaced with government-appointed paramount chiefs who would carry out the wish and the will of the government.
And that too had its own downside.
So when I present these things, we present them through our own eyes and not through the eyes of Westerners or Europeans, I should say. So our eyes are not all the same either, right? So this is our eyes. When I talk about Daniel Howard's perspective, this is also an African perspective. The perspective of the big trees, of course, is they are going to forcibly remove ancient traditions of leadership and rule. I'm going to explain something a little bit and I'm going to be careful not to offend my people and the traditions that I come from. These are Poro kings. These are Sende queens. These are people who come from a very ancient and powerful tradition that transcends the boundaries of Liberia. When a traditional leader in the forest regions, when that traditional leader is a leader, that leader commands and controls everything, the human beings, the animals, the trees. If a hunter shoots a deer in the forest, that hunter brings that deer to this leader and says, "Sir, I found or I killed this animal in the forest." And that leader says to him, "Okay, you've done well, son. Take the leg quarter of this animal and carry it to your family." He keeps the rest. This is our form of taxation. He keeps the rest. And then if there is a warrior who was wounded in battle and can no longer hunt for his family, he'll call him. He'll say, "You know what, say, come here. Our brother from your quarter found this animal in the forest. I gave him some. Here is yours. Carry this for your family. You did well for us in the fight against the Loma people or the Kisi people or whoever they fought that time, right? Here's yours. You carry it. It's for your family." So that's the kind of power they commanded. Nothing belonged to anyone. They had dominion over everything. And so the majority of the population, when do you go to farm? When do you harvest? This is all controlled by this strong central authority. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because this culture is very different from the people who live on the coast, especially in the southeastern part of the country. You do not have that kind of strong centralized legacy. Anthropology explains this very well. So when people say, "Oh, all the Kru people were fighting," it's not really possible because there was no central authority to tell all Kru people to do one thing. Every clan was onto itself. You have alliances of clans, but in this area, the central authority is extremely powerful and strong. So nobody's going to break away and do something else. So when they decided to hew down these trees, you cut off the head, everything else falls apart. So the downside to this, the bad consequence of this, is that now these lesser leaders are not respected the same way that the true Zos were. And they also do not have the credential to be in the position that they were in. They were empowered by a government that is foreign to them. And now you see them referring now to Tubman and probably Howard before him and Barclay before Tubman and King before Barclay. They were probably referring to them in the same submissive way they would have referred to the true Zos of the forest. So now you, president, elected official that have no ties to this tradition, are now being bowed to as if you were replacing these big trees that were hewed down, but they do not have the command or the understanding to behave as the big trees that were hewed down. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's the best way I can put it and be as respectful as possible. Okay, so now you've got soldiers, you've got military that are answering to an authority that is not in sync with their cultural legacy. So a lot of things are going to break down. Let's talk a little bit about Major Young.
So October 19, 1915, Major Young was relieved of his attaché duties and ordered to report to the 10th Cavalry in the United States. The Liberian government and the U.S. State Department requested an extension of Young's mission in West Africa to no avail. Young departed Monrovia on November 25, 1915 for the United States. Liberia's President Daniel E. Howard forwarded a laudatory letter to the U.S. War Department commending Young's work in the country and acknowledged the Liberian government's grateful appreciation of the most valuable services rendered the Republic by Major Young. Howard regretted Young's departure but said he carries with him, however, in his new field of activity, the love and best wishes of a grateful people. The letter was endorsed at the War Department, included as an official entry in Major Young's efficiency record, and forwarded to him on January 7, 1916. Who is Major Young and what did he do?
Major.
Oh yeah, Major Young.
Jabari?
So Major Young was a African American officer. He was significant in the U.S. Army, and so when we create what's called the Frontier Force, he was going to be at the major helm of that creation when they needed to help enforce the boundaries with Britain and France.
Yes, and he also was a Buffalo soldier, and Buffalo soldiers were the African Americans who were sent into the American frontier to decimate Native American populations. And this is where they were really used a lot. And Buffalo soldiers were vicious. Buffalo soldiers were trained to hew down big trees. So Major Young comes in and he is going to train Liberia's frontier forces. He's going to train. A lot of the members of Liberia's frontier forces, those early frontier forces, were people who came from the North and Central Territories who had escaped the tyranny of the big trees in the first place. So you're sending people in who have, some of them have a vendetta. They have scores to settle. You're arming and empowering people who also know the language, which is great, but some of them also were abused as young people, as children, and maybe their villages or towns were burned down by members of other clans and groups. And so now they're being empowered to go back, and some of them still have this vendetta, a score to settle. Next slide, please. So this is just a photo of Monrovia during Howard's time, a legation. The U.S. Group came, and it was just an interesting picture. I thought it was interesting because you see everyone dressed up in their fine hats. What the kind of the atmosphere was like in Monrovia at the time. Next slide, please. So this is around Kessley Barracks, somewhere in what was considered the Marshall Territory where they were training. I think this is really interesting because these guys, most of them were not wearing shoes. Even though they were issued boots, they were not comfortable with the boots. And if you think about it, you know, if you were born and raised not wearing shoes, your feet take a certain natural posture. They become widened and flat, which is actually, and your posture is better. You sit up straighter when you don't wear shoes ever in your life, because that's the way human beings are meant to form. Now, giving people boots whose feet were developed naturally outside of shoes can be extremely uncomfortable. So a lot of times the soldiers would not even wear them because they were painful, because shoes will try to reshape your feet. And if you're already an adult, to put your feet in boots to actually be able to fight is counterproductive. So many of the times when you see soldiers and others barefooted, it's not because they didn't have issue boots. It's because in some cases, most cases, it was because the boots were not comfortable. They were more comfortable fighting and walking without boots.
Right, Carl. I don't know if we're going to go back to Major Young. I mean, why was he relieved? Was he vicious and ruthless, and that's why he was being fired, or what's going on?
It was why he was being what?
Relieved of his post. He was fired, right?
Yeah, Howard later relieves him.
Right. Is it because he committed atrocities?
That's what Howard felt. Howard felt that he was we're going to get into, well, yes. So let me get into it now.
Right.
Howard, so what they were doing, a lot of these guys are being trained by very violent American, very trained. War is about violence. The U.S. Army, the U.S. military was created and born of extreme, unrepentant violence. There was no war crimes tribunal. And, there was none of that at this point in history. So Major Young comes from a tradition of genocidal soldiers. He comes from a tradition of military that was there to snuff out any opposition to the state. He was not an evil man, but he was a trained killer, as soldiers are. People forget this. War is not about, going and conducting diplomacy. When you're sending in the guns, all else has failed. And for those of you watching who are Marines or former Marines, you know that you were trained to kill. And that's what you're trained to do when you're a soldier. Even though we like to, pretend that, war is something nice, it's not nice.
But they are rules of engagement, right?
Carl?
There are modern rules of engagement. So
what I want to get to there is, can you speak a little bit about some of those atrocities that he committed? What did he do specifically?
He personally didn't commit atrocities. Atrocities were committed under, not atrocities is an extreme word. There were a lot of violent abuses that took place by the frontier forces. And that's why he was relieved of his duties. It was really, Howard was not happy with some of the things that went on during his time. And we're gonna get into that if we can go for it.
Okay.
And if I may, the repetition of the frontier force at the time as a result of Major Young training that he brought to Liberia from the Buffalo Soldier. What kind of repetition did they give the frontier force at the time in Africa as a whole?
Well, the frontier forces, if you're comparing them to Africa, they were bunny rabbits. I mean, you cannot compare anything we're talking in the Liberian context, but if you talk about in the colonial context, Liberia had the softest frontier forces of any military.
Mm-hmm.
So Germany literally took 1 million human beings out into the desert and slaughtered them. The British burned whole communities and left miles and miles of charred bodies in order to conquer their interior. So we're not going to get into comparing violence, but there is absolutely no. So I'm talking about Major Young in the context of Liberia and Liberian history and the fact that Liberians in the hinterland had never seen this before.
And remember, this frontier force only comprised about, at max, maybe 1,000, 2,000 people. This was not a huge frontier force. This was just meant to barely just hold it together. This wasn't a.
So they do things, but it's not. You can't compare those to what was happening.
They're not even at that level.
Yeah, but this was a violent group. Let's limit it to Liberia, not.
Because you start comparing it to other groups, and it's going to look like they weren't violent. They were nice. Right. So because the way the Europeans did things was so extreme and evil. You have to remember Major Young's a black man. He sees his own people as human beings. The Europeans didn't see us as human beings.
Yep.
But Mayor Young is
And
coming
so
from,
also Major Young's mission here is not genocide. It's take out big trees.
right, and coming from a place where he was on a mission to annihilate uh, American Indians, and going to a place where he might have been looking at the people to the indigenous has just like the natives, the
No,
American natives.
no, he didn't. He didn't. And even in his writings, he didn't.
Okay,
So that's not a historically accurate assumption.
no, I'm asking because it's possible that he looked, because this man
He
was
didn't
relieved.
though. He didn't. In fact,
He did what he did with his job.
and let me also say this: the entire military was native.
Yeah.
And the people he was training were native. He didn't train
Yeah.
Native Americans to go kill other Native Americans. He was being sent by white soldiers to kill Native Americans. In this case, he knows he's in Africa. He knows he's African. He's training Africans. And the Africans that he's training are going into places that they come from. So it is not analogous at all. My only point for bringing up the Buffalo Soldiers was to say that this is where he got his training from.
Okay.
But he cannot apply that in this scenario for so many reasons, mainly because, one, he's not on a genocide mission. Two, the people who are carrying out the mission are from the same places they're going to, with the exception of a handful of Madingos and Crews and others that are in there. Majority of these people come from the Pella, Loma, Bandi ethnic groups.
But they were fighting each other before, not because Pele, Loma, they were fighting, right?
Some of the members of the frontier forces had vendettas because they had escaped war. There might have been one group that had conquered the town and maybe they had to flee to Monrovia for refuge. So some of them, members of the forces, had vendettas, which I've already said.
Mm-hmm.
But that does not mean that they were on a mission for genocide. There was no genocide occurring under Major Young. What did occur under Major Young were violent put downs of mutinies, which we're going to talk about. And that's the violent put down of mutinies that he's really relieved of his duty for. And so we have, for example, you can keep the slide here or take it off or whatever. I just like these pictures. These are training photos of the Frontiers Forces armed. There were members of the Frontier Forces, Bandi members of the Frontier Forces, who were loyal to Great Britain. You remember during Arthur Barclay's time, we talked about how the British had already infiltrated the Liberian militia that they set up. And they had them almost overthrow the Liberian government. Well, now, under Major Young, you have a conflict in the northwestern part of Liberia boundary, in the Gola Forest, where you have Bandi insurgents within the group rebelling and fighting, setting up their own group and fighting the frontier forces from within the frontier forces. Cooper and Lomax, who were trained by Major Young, under his influence, Major Young actually was not present, but this is one of the reasons that he was relieved of his duty. They decide they're going to, instead of chaining them and marching them back to Monrovia, they execute them without a trial on the front line, on the battlefield. They get them, they execute them, and they move on. Cooper and Lomax, later, the British are all upset because they were British subjects that were implanted, and the British basically report themselves in their own correspondence, because why would they care? Because they are the ones that sent the people to disrupt the military. But at the end of the day, the British write the Americans and like, oh, Major Young trained Cooper and Lomax. They went and killed these Bandi insurgents, and the British were acting like they were so upset. The same British that were calling Liberians creatures before are saying that they killed these people and it was wrong. So Cooper and Lomax are then brought to Liberia because of pressure from the United States government to stand trial for executing these Bandi soldiers. A lot of times in the oral tradition, like remember, they were Bandi chiefs. They were not actually chiefs; they were members of the frontier forces. They executed these Bandi soldiers, and Cooper and Lomax are brought back on trial. They explain their case. They are then, what is the word I'm looking for? Acquitted by the judiciary. They're acquitted by the jury, and they then go on about their lives. But as a result, Major Young is relieved of his duty. There was also an incident in Kru territory where insurgents who had planted the British flag were supposed to have been executed when they were tried. Those particular people were actually tried and they were supposed to be executed. President Howard commuted their sentences to life imprisonment, but a lot of them were executed anyway, even though the president had commuted their sentences. So some of these atrocities and things, I mean, we'll say atrocities, these killings were didn't set well with Daniel Howard. At no time did Daniel Howard seem to regret, however, the hewing of the big trees in the rainforest. And those people in that North and Central Territory that were removed and replaced by paramount chiefs, government-appointed paramount chiefs, many of their names we'll never know. They're erased forever. And some of them were women. Some of those big trees that were hewed down, those big political trees, some of them were women, because we do come from a balanced, gender balanced ancestry. People don't like to admit it because we become Muslim, we become Christian, but women held positions of power. Suakoko was not the only female political tree in the forest. There were others. Ganta is named after a woman ruler like Suakoko, Bega Wampa, and she was, or Be Gawon, and then Gawonpa is the name of the town named after her. But this woman was just like Suakoko. She was a military leader. She was a big political tree in the rainforest. She was also hewed down in order to make way for incorporation.
Right.
So when people say, go ahead.
No, yeah, you can continue, because those paramount chiefs, were they puppets of the central government, or they were actually people who care about those areas for which they were?
I'm confused about what you're asking.
I'm asking,
what are you talking about?
Those paramount chiefs that replaced those big trees that were hewed down.
Okay.
What was their relationship to the people now they were leading?
So a lot of times there's different reasons different people were made paramount chief. So a lot of them were former frontier force people. Some of them were people that had clout in the traditional society. Some of them were people who, maybe were rivals to the former leaders that were hewed down, and then they were put up in their place. They were always people who would be loyal and submissive to the Liberian government, because now the government becomes the big tree. So now the government becomes the big tree. This is why when I, as a mono woman, I'm going to be very personal with this. This is why I, as a mono woman, when people talk about, oh, the people didn't let us become citizens, I'm like, really? Did everybody want to be a citizen of Liberia? Because I'm a descendant of a big tree. I'm a descendant of a big tree. And I know that that is not what we necessarily wanted at the time it happened. Though we did fight to have the territory before Howard's time. When Wosulu fell and the French tried to conquer us, we defended that area. Our ancestors defended that area and maintained it as part of the Liberian territory. They were able to successfully keep the French from taking, if you look at the map of Liberia, that huge chunk of Lofa and that huge chunk of Nimba that stick up into Zerikore, it's not a gift. It's not an accident. There was bloodshed to maintain those areas. And so it was the same big trees, those political trees that fought to maintain those areas as sovereign, who are now being hewed down or to turn over to the central government.
Thank you.
And so from their perspective, it's like, wait a minute, we kept these Europeans at bay, but we're not able to keep our own people at bay. And Howard's perspective is, if we don't come in here and take this place, all these people are going to end up Guinean. So again, both sides are correct and rational, and their positions make sense.
Yeah, we have 8 minutes to close. I don't know if you want to finish the presentation or that be part of.
I mean, that really does finish the presentation. You could just, go through the photos. There's just some really beautiful.
I see some beautiful photos here.
Yeah, you can skip over the thing by Howard. There's a letter from Howard. You can skip that. But it's just.
It's a chief and his better guy.
Yeah, this is I can't pronounce that. Toba Koni. I can't pronounce it. Yeah, he's a chief from a town. Those are his bodyguards. So we've got some. You can skip that slide, Dennis, because we don't have time to go over that issue. And then just some pictures of prominent Bezon people. Also, this is the one you're on right now is the Liberian Senate, and I think this is the Senate. And then the next one should be the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
And then these are, some prominent Bezon people. Lieutenant Roberts is son of the former Chief Justice. He was in the Liberia Frontier Forces, one of those who also went to the North Central Territory with Young.
And then Honorable James.
And he was a Bassa man. Somerville was from Bassa, but Somerville is a descendant of a repatriated African American, and Lieutenant Roberts was Bassa. And then I think this is cabinet ministers with members of the House of Representatives.
Yeah. So
the last slide basically is Edwin Barkley spew about the death of Daniel Howard. Next week, when we talk about the Fernando Po Firestone crisis, we're going to have more to discuss about Howard. So Howard doesn't just stop here. But this is what Edwin Barkley said about Howard in his address. He said this on December 19th, 1935, when he addressed it as part of his address to the Liberian Congress, the legislature. Either Jabari or Dennis.
It is with regret that I have to announce to you the death of Honorable Daniel E. Howard, a former president of this republic, which took place on the 9th July of this year. Mr. Howard was at the head of the government at a very critical period of the country's history and conducted affairs in such a manner as to safeguard the essential interests of the republic. This he was able to accomplish on account of his wide experience in public affairs, having devoted most of his life to the public service.
Yeah, so that's how briefly and kind of matter-of-factly he talks about Howard, Mr. Barkley does. And you'll find out why when we get to his presidency, but he didn't really spend much time on talking about Howard's demise. But that is what happened under our first and only Bassa president.
Bronskin didn't come close, huh?
No, he would have been.
All right, we're almost to the end, and we're going to have part 2 and have all the questions answered and the calls. Few comments.
Yeah. Do you want to? Are there any comments that you think need to be answered quickly?
Michael say Charles Young was brought in to keep white American officers out, especially when it was found that the early white officers worked against Liberian interests and tried to overthrow the country. You know, we
So
answered this question.
really quickly, Michael, you're almost 100% correct, except that the white officers were British. They were not. They were British. They were not white Americans. There was one British officer that was brought to train, and after that, like Burin said, no, we'll only have. They didn't want to have any more people of European descent training their soldiers.
Right. And
the British still infiltrated anyway. We'll get into war that next week.
This question answers itself. Elvis Morris, a European name, is asking how did all these Basel people get European names? And Elvis, you're crown and you have European names, so I think that answered the question. If this was about politics, you will see a lot of people sharing this show. And talking about politics, something that I want to address it. You say, so, okay. I always like to hear from Mr. Coker, an elder. He said, my first time hearing that Daniel E. Howard was Basel, though I attended the Daniel E. Howard Elementary School on Touré Avenue, Monrovia. So-called, believe me when I tell you this, we didn't learn this. So Solomon is not sure why we are talking about. He said, with all the important things going on in Liberia, is Daniel E. Howard you guys talking about? Are you guys serious? So
yes, we're serious.
I responded, I said, your comment is very unfortunate because you want us to discuss G's and fries, and sorry to disappoint you. Come back next time.
But these are G's and fries in a sense, right? It's G's. It's just old G's. So that's all. I can't see the comments on Facebook. Is that all the interesting stuff?
Yeah, no, those are the interesting ones.
Okay. Well.
Well, I guess on that note, that is how we will come to the end of yet another edition of the Liberian History Channel with our presenter, Carl, and co-presenter, Jabari. Any closing comments from each of you before we close?
Yeah, I'll go first. I just want to remind everyone to be cognizant of time period. What I've noticed since we started doing this is people tend to not understand how long ago this was. People tend to think that their grandparents were alive, during Daniel Howard's time or during Charles D.B. This is 1900. So my mother was born in 1956. So my grandmother was born somewhere around 1930, right? So my great grandparents were alive around this time. And if you're younger than I am, if you're my daughter's age, these are your great grandparents' era, So we have to always remember how many generations ago this was and how much has happened since then. Understanding that this is not yesterday and there are no living witnesses to these events. We're going off of what we read in documents. That's really, really important to understand the context. I just wanted to point that out. So if you have somebody who's alive today that says, oh, I was in the frontier forces, they were not in Howard's frontier forces, right? If somebody is alive today and they can say, Counselor Yaso Waidole, he can say his father was a young boy during Howard's time because Counselor Dollier is an elder and his father was also very old when he was born. So that's a longer stretch of time. But for most of us, we're a few generations removed from these incidents. Most people alive today are. I just wanted to point that out because I think we get confused about time period and context.
Right. And it interests you to know that my father was born during the presidency of Daniel E. Howard.
What?
Yes. Let me tell you that tomorrow on the noonday, we have biblical marriage versus Christ-like marriage. The guest, Keith Harris, he's the author and former pastor. He's also the co-owner of a group. He does podcasts. Priscilla J. Yunato, the host of Noonday, will be here at 12 noon. Please tune in. This is interesting.
That's going to be awesome.
Yeah. Barry, you're closing?
All I have to say is we need to claim all of our history. You should be able to see yourself in all of the presidents and all of their administration, no matter what background they come from. I admire Daniel E. Howard for his presidency, his post presidency, even though he's Bassa, because a win from one of them is a win for all of us. And if we see it as a win for one is a win for all, it will be so much better.
Well, on that note, I don't know how we changed from miles to kilometer. I saw the letter to Todman from the Parliament chief talking about miles, but then anytime I'm hearing go Liberia kilometer,
they are confused. I keep telling them.
What's
that
going on?
That Burna Boy song, Killing Me. That Burna Boy turned the whole thing, blame the Nigerians.
Right. We mix everything up.
Blame the Nigerians and Echo Morg.
Yeah. And those of us who were in Nigeria, Ghana, in fact, they now say instead of majoring economics, say I'm reading economics. And all those kind of nonsense they do now in Liberia, mixing it. And it really angers me, irritates me when it's coming from journalists and ministries.
Oh, it's annoying. I hear you. It's so true.
Official publication from ministries just mixing things up. They don't even know the difference.
Road signs saying kilometers instead of miles because they've got, Chinese and other people. We've completely severed ourselves from our past. It's horrible. It's horrible.
I know. All right.
But
on that note, we will close our broadcast with no other song other than the song that says, "We are all Liberians." We know Howard was Bassa, and he was a Liberian, and we are all Liberians. That song is closing us right now. Next Saturday, another edition is coming on. Please make time to tune in. And
it will be about Firestone. Imagine that.
Yeah, Firestone. Then is that 1926? Okay. We're going
to talk about Firestone and Fernando Po.
Fernando Po. In my town, they call it Napo.
Napo.
Yes, people go to Napo. It's Fernando Po.
Yeah.
Napo.
Okay. Bye-bye, folks.
We are Liberia. Liberia is our home. Liberia people. Liberia.